Students, happy to see you. So last week we got through book 3, and this week you'll be reading up to book 7. One thing that we didn't really get into last week but comes to the forefront this week is this idea that your education makes you capable or incapable of certain things. And you can probably tell by now that what Socrates means by education is something broader than what we mean by it, right? We think about education, we think about standardized testing and degrees, or even to get more specific, if you were asked what kind of education you received, you might mention your degree and then talk about a curriculum. But for Plato, the idea of education is much more broad. Everything, in a way, educates us. We're educated just by virtue of existing in the world and being exposed to different ideas in ways we may not imagine, right? So this is why his discussion of poetry is so important. His discussion of myth and religion, his discussion of music, even. He thinks all of those things, when we imbibe them, kind of make up who we are or play a role in who we are, in the sense that we either internalize or reject certain things that come from them. So an example that he gives, right, is the example of the way that the gods behave, particularly that Zeus sleeps with his sister and that Zeus is an adulterer. So what do we learn from this? He says, well, if someone is raised with this idea of what Zeus is like, then what do they think justice is? Because the creator, or not the creator of the world, but the God of the world, behaves in these immoral ways, in these unjust ways. And that means what? That means that we, the human, may be able to do that too, or perhaps justice means something different than keeping a promise or not sleeping with your sister. Or sleeping with your sister might be okay. So it's about what you consume. And you can think about the things we consume now, how they form us. One common thing you may think of is beauty standards. What do we think is beautiful? How has it changed from in the past? Why has it changed? Is it because what we see is beautiful, presented on television, is what we take to be beautiful? Probably. So all of this becomes more important now. There's a line in what we read last time where Plato says, at least it's likely that the starting point of a man's education sets the course of what follows. So I'll repeat that. At least it's likely that the starting point of a man's education sets the course of what follows. And that's significant for us for the rest of the dialogue. Remember that the Cydian speech is a response to Glaucon and Adamantus' challenge, right? Which is they take up Thrasymachus' claim that justice is nothing but the will of the stronger, but force. And they tell Socrates, convince us not only that justice is, useful, right? But also that it's good, that it would make us happy. Convince us that justice would make us happy. And so in this part of the dialogue, we have the differentiation of the city into the 3 parts, right? You have the guardians, the auxiliaries, and the craftsmen. And the guardians are gold, auxiliaries silver, craftsmen bronze, but they all comprise the city, right? And remember that this is for the sake of answering Glaucon and Adamantus. And remember, too, that I told you not to be too literal about this if you want to get the fullest meaning of what we're doing here. So it's going to turn out that for Plato, in order to be happy when you're a human, you have to be capable of virtue. You have to be capable of virtue. And your virtue in some ways depends on your nature, right? Okay, so he talks about the division of people into these different classes by nature of what you're capable of, but also by education, right? And that's why the guardians can and cannot do specific things. Okay, the guardians can and cannot do specific things because we need them to behave in a certain way. And Plato thinks the way we behave comes from the disposition of our soul, essentially, and our capacity to be able to act virtuously. So we'll get into that in more detail. It's going to be the case that there are 4 virtues. They're the 4 cardinal virtues. They're not the 3 theological virtues, which are faith, hope, and love, which come up a lot in medieval thought, in addition to the cardinal virtues. But the 4 cardinal virtues are wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. And it may seem like that's fairly straightforward, but he means certain things by each of those words that in some ways are kind of counterintuitive for us now. Wisdom is not just knowledge in the sense of being able to repeat what's in a textbook, right? Or to perform some kind of calculation. Wisdom is something that good lawmakers need. So it requires knowledge of rule, and it is property of the guardian class, right? But it's not like the producer's skill. It's something concerning rule. It's making the right decisions about the city's affairs. And so part of wisdom is, the kind of knowledge that comes from a more narrow understanding of education. But part of it is being able to make a smart choice in a difficult time. So the example I always like to give is the example of King Solomon, who is known for his wisdom, right? And 2 women come to him claiming that they are the mother of a baby, and he doesn't know how to determine who's who, and yet he is politically responsible for this kingdom, and he needs to make the determination. So in order to be wise, what he does is he says, I will split this baby in half, and each of you will get a piece. And of course, the woman who really is the mother is dismayed and says, no, anything but that. You can have him, to the other woman. You can have him, my baby. And what Solomon realizes is that in doing this, he is going to reveal who the real mother is. Okay, that is a good example of political wisdom. The kind of wisdom needed to rule, because it's particular, it's applied to the circumstance, it has a knowledge of the natures of the citizens involved, a knowledge of immediate facts, right? And he thinks of it very quickly. Okay, so wisdom is going to be a combination, I guess, of a lot of things. Because if you think of King Solomon and his wisdom, he was very learned, right? So learning is a major part of this. And you see that when we talk about the divided line. But then you also have to be able to apply it to particulars. Okay, and so knowledge here, wisdom here is particularly applied to rule, right? To judgment. Courage is something that maybe departs the most from what we think of as courage. A lot of times when we think of courage, we might think, right, the courage of someone who faces death, right? They have cancer and it's a long, prolonged struggle and they die. Okay, that's a type of courage. Sometimes we think about courage as somebody who jumps out of an airplane with a parachute. They're courageous, they're brave. That would not be courageous for Plato. Sometimes, you have the ethical dilemma of the courageous Nazi, right? The Nazi who maybe throws himself on a grenade to protect other Nazis. right? But would we want to say that a Nazi had courage? Okay, so let's sort of sort through what Plato means by courage. It's a weird definition. It's the power to preserve the correct belief about what is to be feared or what is terrifying and what isn't. Okay, that is odd. And this again goes to this idea of education, of internalizing what your culture praises as good or bad. Courage is being able to hold on to the right belief of what you should actually fear. It's an opinion of what should scare you. Okay, and this is part of why the auxiliaries have to be trained carefully on careful myths, right? That will teach them to be afraid of the right things. And for example, not to fear death. Okay, if you have myths that teach them to fear death, then they're not going to be very good in battle. The comparison he gives is to wool dyed purple, and I think it's not something we understand, but the purple dye was a color fast dye, meaning it didn't run. And so for Plato, courage is holding on to the right idea about something under duress. Okay, so for example, it's one thing for someone to say, oh, I would never I would never have my baby in my womb lose their life in an emergency pregnancy. I would lose my life instead, right? I would not permit a procedure that would harm them, right? Okay, so that maybe someone thinks that, right? But then when they're actually there on the hospital bed and they're facing this kind of decision under that kind of duress, how do they act? Or you might say that you have somebody, and I think this is a better example. You have somebody, right, who always judges very harshly those who lived in the Holocaust and, for example, didn't hide the Jews. And then they're placed in a similar situation, and they're not capable of the kind of bravery of hiding people that are facing death for whatever reason. This would be someone in a particular way who lacks courage, right? They had the right opinion in this case, right, which is that you should preserve the lives of the vulnerable, right, of those who are being pursued by the regime for an unjust death. But when it comes down to it, they're not able to perform. Now, moderation and justice are very close to one another in the text, and I think sometimes it's easy to not really see how they're different, and that might be something good to reflect on this week if you're interested in the question. Moderation, I think, is best understood as mastery of the better part over the worst part. Mastery of the better part over the worst part. And in the city and speech, at one point in the dialogue, it's ascribed to the producer class, who have to be able to moderate their appetites and receive direction from the higher classes, the ones above them. It also is the case, though, that as you continue in the dialogue, that moderation characterizes the interaction between all of the classes in the city, okay, between all of the classes in the city. And a good way to think of moderation is what Socrates calls a unanimity, an accord of the worse and better, according to nature. So like a harmony. If you think about moderation, a way to kind of bring it to life is, so I have celiac disease, so I can't eat any gluten, okay? And let's say that I'm over at my parents' and they're eating fried chicken. I love fried chicken. I can't eat fried chicken anymore, but I love it. So you might say, if you watch me sitting with them and eating something boring, like just a plain dry chicken breast, you might say, oh, Dr. Banyulo is so moderate. Look at her. She is not eating that fried chicken. Okay. But the thing is, in order to really be moderate, the chicken would have to be something that I didn't want. Like the mastery of my mind over my appetite would have to be, this chicken is bad for you, Ashleen, and you don't want it. Okay, and everything stays in the right order, and then my appetite's like, okay, you don't want it. What's more likely the case is that I'm going to be looking at it and drooling. That wouldn't be moderate. That would be wrong to say that I was moderate there. Justice is something kind of close. It's also not associated with one specific class, but the ordered composition of the whole. There's a part in the dialogue here where Socrates calls it doing one's own work, not meddling in the work of others, giving to the city what is owed by nature, right? And which is also tied to harmony. Only the rulers will make important decisions. Only the soldiers will participate in military activities. So what's the difference between temperance and justice? And I think that this is again where the subject of education becomes important, because it seems in what we read last time that Socrates goes on and on and on about the auxiliaries will listen to this kind of music but not that kind, and this kind of flute sound makes them march, and this kind of flute sound makes them calm, and this kind of flute sound makes them want to have sex. And that just seems weird. So, but it's not weird. There's a part that emerges in that section of the Republic where you begin to see that what music does is it gives you a taste for the whole. A taste for the whole. Think about... You think about listening to a piece of music, right? And if you become trained well in music, then you can hear the meanings of different things. So that sounds kind of abstract, but let's say you either have a really good natural pitch, or you have some amount of musical training or musical practice. You're listening to a song and you hear this discordant chord, and it's not supposed to be there, because sometimes there are discordant chords that are supposed to be there, and sometimes there are ones that not. It's a mistake. It sounds bad. Your ear can pick that up. That is not a part of the whole. That should not be there. This is why training in music might help for justice. And it's because you're watching how some people are behaving, or you're analyzing a certain situation, or you're thinking of your own behavior and something strikes you as discordant. It's off. It doesn't fit in an ordered way into the whole. This is another thing, the Greeks and beauty, right? They think beauty is all about balance and symmetry. Okay, that is also about things belonging in a certain part and staying in that part. So I think it's probably good to think of justice as a virtue of the whole, right? And in fact, that's what we end up seeing, is that justice is the virtue of the whole city. Justice is the virtue of the whole city. We go on then to see further, right, that you have the introduction of the tripartite soul in the human, right? Reason, thumos, and appetite. And what Plato ends up saying is that what maps on what the city is maps onto those three parts of the human soul. So the city has three natural classes, right? And the city is just when we see the virtues in that city in all the right parts. And having all the right relations to one another. So in the same way, we see the individual soul divided into three parts. And this is because the city is the soul writ large. Okay, that's important. The city is the soul writ large. The single man with these forms in his soul, thanks to the same affections as those in the city, rightly lays claim to the same name being justice. This is what Socrates says. So let's just talk briefly about the parts of the soul in the next section. So we're talking about the parts of the soul: rational part, the thumotic or spirited part, and the appetitive part. Okay, and I really like talking about this part because I like talking about thumos. The rational part seems pretty clear to me. It's the part that corresponds with the rulers, and it's the smallest part of the soul. Because if you think about the way a city works, right, especially the city in speech, the largest number is producers, and then there's a smaller contingent of the auxiliaries, and then even fewer guardians. It's like a triangle, like a pyramid, okay? So in our soul, then, the rational part calculates about what is good for us, but there's a conflict between reason and desire at times. And so let's say that your appetitive part tells you you're thirsty, right? And then you're in the desert, you find a pool of water, and it looks kind of dirty. Okay, reason might tell you don't drink that, and your appetites might say, yes, drink that. I mean, we can all think of times when our reason and our desire conflict. This is where thumos comes in, and this corresponds with the auxiliaries. And so it's a really weird thing, because if it's working correctly, it should ally with reason. Okay, if it's working correctly, it should ally with reason. If it's not working correctly, it can ally with appetites. It's difficult to understand. I think it's not rational, really. The best way to think of it, it might be the kind of feeling you have in your soul, or in you. We don't even have to use the word soul. When you're angry about something, or you're ashamed. Like, let's say that someone insults your mother. The first thing you feel is rage. Well, maybe not. I mean, I would be mad. I would just, without even thinking, that's terrible, right? I'm angry. But it's like a movement inside me. I'm not choosing to be angry. I'm responding to a perceived injustice, okay? And we can become angry or ashamed over things that we really should be angry or ashamed about, or we can be angry or ashamed about things that it's irrational to be angry or ashamed about. It's the most elusive part of our soul for Socrates. You might even say that the thumotic part is the part of us that might aspire, right? That might have an image of who our hero is and who we want to be. And then the thumotic part is part of what can move us, can drive us to behave in that kind of way. But the thumotic part can become also the force that makes us very destructive when we choose to do something that is not good. So you might think here of the character of Darth Vader, right? Darth Vader does all these terrible things, but he's incredibly gifted. The problem is that he makes his reason, which is great, right? He's supposed to be brilliant, the slave of his appetites, his power, love of rule for its own sake. And then thumos enters the picture to help him do this, to help him carry it out. And he is extremely destructive for this reason. Hi. So I go into a lot of detail on the parts of the human soul and on the virtues because in some ways I think that that's kind of I don't know, maybe understudied, or there are other parts of Plato's Republic that you've probably thought of before, or heard of before, like the City of Pigs, or the Ring of Gyges, or the Philosopher King, right? But the description of the virtues in the soul does a lot of work in the dialogue, and so I want to spend some time talking about that, and that's why I go on for as long as I do. The three waves are, also kind of an area where you can get in pretty deeply. And I'm going to get into it less deeply because I feel like you need less guidance here, but I do want to point some things out. The first is that the reason they're called waves is because they're waves of laughter. Socrates says that he's going to be laughed at for suggesting these things. The next thing I want to point out is that this is a part of the text, I think, where it's really important that you ask yourself, why is Socrates saying this? Why is he saying this? Does he literally mean that we need to take away all the children and from their mothers and share them in common with each other, and that humans will be okay with that, right? Does he literally mean that we will never fall in love with somebody and just be dedicated to that one person and want them to the exclusion of all others? Does he literally mean that we will never own property? If I'm right that he's not being literal in his political suggestions here, it's not the case that there isn't a political meaning. I think when he talks about the three waves, that he's trying to teach us something about human nature and politics, right? Even if he's not being literal and saying that a good city would not have parents and children. I think it's the case that he's trying to point out to you something about human nature that makes politics difficult, okay? Or that the good politician would need to consider. So let's take the waves in parts. The first wave has women as guardians, which was really radical for the time, and that would be something interesting to think about if you wanted to reflect on it, because Greek women, especially Athenian Greek women, were not thought of very highly. But part of what comes up here, right, is that the man and the woman would live together in the barracks. They would wrestle together naked, and Socrates says this isn't going to be a problem. And it seems here then that he's suggesting that Eros, and actually I think that in this part and in the divided line, the symposium kind of is useful for you. That Eros isn't going to play that much of a part, right, in the human. And this is part of why people laugh, but this is the paradox that's going on. He's suggesting this to you to make you think, is that really possible for men and women to be alongside each other and not desire each other? Or take it to another level, is it really possible for them to be alongside each other and not fall in love with each other? The next, it's a similar kind of thought, right? The community of wives and children and this sort of lottery, right? You have sex by a fake lottery when the state tells you to, with the person the state tells you to, even though you think it's at random. Who's picked, for who is the nuptial number. And then you have your children, and your children are taken away from you, and you don't care. You don't look for your child in the cohort of children born that year. And again, what is the significance of this? Well, when people become devoted to one partner, when they become devoted to their children, when they have their little property, their own little home, are they going to be totally devoted to the city? The guardians can't be, right? The guardians and the auxiliaries can't be. They have to think of the whole, right? So they can't have these particular affections. But at the same time, you should be asking yourself, is there a parent or a lover that could do this? What are Plato's motives in suggesting these rules? That we can just identify our own good so completely with the good of the city. And I think he's being ironic. the point is to get us to think about love of one's own and the importance of love of one's own and sort of a stumbling block it is, not necessarily in a bad way, to politics. Are there any jobs or relationships or commitments that would get in between you and what the political community or some authority outside of you would say? Probably, yes. Okay, and so now we come back again to the city soul question at this point in the dialogue, because Glaucon, just after the waves, he's like, this is not possible. Humans are not going to live this way. And if we made this kind of regime, how would it be sustained? And it's at this point that Socrates says that the city is... I don't know how to put this. He says, we're not seeking the description of the city of a speech for its own sake, but we're seeking it for the sake of a pattern, okay? For the sake of a pattern of what justice looks like, okay? And you remember earlier that justice is this particular ordering, okay? It's a particular ordering. So I think, again, right, we need to try to think about what these suggestions are going to tell us about the political. So the divided line is significant. I encourage you to look at the diagram in the back of Bloom's Republic to see exactly what it looks like. I'd remind you that it's an ascent, right? And we've seen the importance of ascent in the symposium. You're making this ascent from images to the forms. And you can see how then education in the form of stories and music is important. Those are images, right? And he wants a good image, a true myth reflects the form in a way that everyone can understand, okay? But people who are more gifted at philosophy can ascend up the divided line and come to know more of what's true. This doesn't mean, for example, that someone who's not capable of philosophy would never get to know something good or something just, but may understand it in images, right? And this is why the stories that are told in the city, what's held up as honorable in the city, is so important, because this may be as far as most people can go. The cave is something that I think the secondary literature deals with pretty well, and you're already probably fairly aware of. But some things to ask yourself about the cave. Why does the one who leaves the cave return, right? If they have made this ascent to see what is beautiful, to see what is glorious, why do they go back? And I would suggest that the virtue of courage probably plays a role here. And the virtue of justice, really understanding the whole. If it's the case that this is the truth, then, and it's the case that the cave was this place that kept you from the truth, then don't you owe it to those who were in your community to return? I mean, it seems to be a question of justice. People disagree on this, but I think you can make the case. The cave also leaves you with an understanding of the world as one that is really contingent on who's in charge. Okay, and this again is why opinion and education matter so much. When the puppet masters are having the people who are chained to the wall see certain images, it's for the sake of manipulation, right? And I suggested that the divided line shows us that there can be good images that guide you. The puppet masters don't do that. And I think what Plato's saying here is that most regimes are interested, like Thrasymachus says, in sustaining their own power. So the cave becomes really important because it can become a way that we ask ourselves, how can assent, right, assent to the form of the good, how can philosophy become something that can be clarifying for politics, right? That can be something that makes politics more than just manipulation, more than just the shepherd eating their sheep. And that's kind of where I'll leave you, because then we're going to get into the question of regimes and regime deterioration next time.